The first sergeant suddenly opened his eyes as the first flakes of grayish snow fell on his worn forehead. Still half asleep, he instinctively patted his cold and atrophied limbs to check if they were still attached to his body. Delighted that his legs were still in one piece and not scattered around a 10-foot radius, he brought his wrist to his face, hoping the watch would grant him a few more minutes of desperately needed respite. Just as his eyes were about to focus on the small quadrant, an unbearable alarm started ringing, shaking him awake to his very soul. Cursing the object and its creators, the sergeant slowly stood up from his hole in the ground and unhurriedly swept away the thin yet sticky layers of dirty snow mixed with fine ash that had accumulated over his drenched uniform. After stretching and yawning, he slung his rifle over his shoulder and held the sling close to his chest. With weighty steps, he started walking over the fresh snow, leaving behind deep footprints in the early hours of the day. The veteran sergeant headed towards the forest's edge, where trenches overlooked the plains from atop the ridgeline. On his way, he rummaged in his deep pockets until his hand recognized the familiar shape of a flimsy box from which he extracted a cigarette, miraculously still dry. Walking past a small campfire surrounded by quiet soldiers, he filled his canteen with a black, hot, and dubious drink from a helmet hung off a tripod of sticks that acted as makeshift pot in the absence of one. Thirsty and cold, he hazarded a quick sip before regrettingly spitting out the poison disguised as broth. As he wiped his mouth with his sleeve, he accidentally stained the 5 service stripes sewn onto the back, each representing 1 year with the uniform. Under normal circumstances, he would have cleaned them right away, but at that moment, he had more pressing concerns to attend. As he steadily made his way through the barren grounds of the leafless forest of burnt tree stumps, a familiar sound started echoing in the distance. At first, he thought nothing of it as, after all this time, the sounds of explosions, as well as the agonizing screams of the wounded or the unbearable silent stares of the dead, became mere background noise to some like him. Just as the sound of passing cars is for granted at all times of the day in big cities, the blast of artillery is an everyday constant on the front lines. On the other hand, it would be suspicious to have a night of quietness there, where the fighting is the most intense. But the sergeant's ears were sharp, and his intuition was even more so. Something about this particular barrage felt unfamiliar, unheard of, alien even. But, as much as he tried, he could not figure out what this disquieting incognita was. He hurried up, and as soon as he cleared the treeline, he jumped inside the muddy trenches, filled ankle-high with stagnant and repugnant water of untold months of rain and filth. Struggling, he hardly dragged his boots towards the highest viewpoint of the labyrinth, Hill 17, returning the salute to the few soldiers who still bothered to stand as he passed by. For each exhausting step he took, his senses awaked just a little more from the uneasy slumber, so much so that when he finally reached the observation post, he was fully awake and sure something was inexplicably wrong. "Sarge," the corporal mumbled while chewing on a particularly hard and untasty meat ration. As he finally gulped down the stubborn strip of flesh, he offered to his superior a steaming flask containing yet another uninviting dark, gooey liquid, which was promptly refuted as the non-commissioned officer shoved away the soldier's hand and quickly climbed the dugout's parapet without saying a word. The corporal was surprised when the sergeant declined the drink he offered, as the other did not distort his sight from the trenches of the contact line just a couple of kilometers from their position. The two had been comrades in arms for several years already and had developed a deep respect and bond with each other. He knew from experience that nothing good ever happens when the senior enlisted had that worried look on his face. Without needing to be told, he jumped down from his modest seat, which was an empty ammo crate, to grab a muddy and moldy box from the rusty foldable table riddled with holes. With grunts of frustration and some standard-issued imprecations, he shook it open, revealing 2 pairs of binoculars in dire need of maintenance. After giving them a good swipe from dirt and snow with the end of his mantle, he handed one set to the sergeant. The shelling started precisely at 0430 hours. "Nothing out of the ordinary," the corporal reported, bringing the lenses to his eyes. "Call the HQ," the other replied while methodically scanning the forward, friendly positions. Hearing the command, the corporal turned to his right and nodded to the young private silently standing beside them who, without needing any more instructions, disappeared behind the muddy edge of the trench line, seemingly without making a sound. Quite perceptive, the new guy. Isn't he, Sarge? What's bothering you? He finally asked, noticing that the sergeant was not in the mood for witty remarks, unlike his usual self. The enemy artillery is different tonight. What? No way. How is it any different? The barrage started just as I woke up, as usual. The corporal commented while, in a futile attempt, trying to get a better resolution by bringing his eyeballs closer to the binoculars as the bright flashes of explosions tearing through the first line reflected on the dark lenses in the moonless night. As usual, each deflagration carried a massive load of energy that manifested with visible shockwaves and even more noticeable plumes of dust and debris, which dotted the entirety of the line. Sir, the HQ is not answering our calls. All the lines are occupied, the young private reported, having seemingly popped up the mud from nowhere, followed by the radio man, panting and whispering curses as his back arched under the weighty and bulky device. That's not good. That's never a good sign. The two soldiers commented as they stared at the deadly fireworks show, seemingly hypnotized by the bright lights and thundering claps. But as much as he strained his brain to encrypt what unknown variable was out of the ordinary during that seemingly ordinary event, even with all those bright flashes before them, the corporal's mind remained lost in the dark. I'm not following, Sarge. Compared to last week, this shelling isn't even that intense. There's something different tonight. Listen. Oh, I'm listening. But I swear to the heavens I'm either too old or too dumb to notice a difference. Maybe I've finally gone deaf. The grizzled veteran nodded on reflection of agreement with his last statement, as his face assumed a somewhat cruel expression of acknowledgement. Artillery is the music of the battlefield, and each army its own orchestra. The sergeant replied with an unexpectedly meaningful tone, which his subordinate found hard to take seriously. Fearing harsh reprisals for speaking up, the corporal limited himself to worryingly looking at him through the very tail of his left eye. As he tilted his head towards his right shoulder, one eyelash arched upward while the opposing eyelid significantly thinned. I'm being serious, said the first as his voice held cold reserve. Even if they might sound and look the same to the careless observer, each army's artillery is different and unique. For example, Keltian barrages are much shorter and more intense than the average Ryugian shelling. And who are we listening to now? Replied the witted corporal as he watched absently the first lines. That I don't know. But you must know something since you brought it up. All I know is that we have never faced this enemy. It's the first time I've heard this terrifying symphony. The coalition must have shifted units around. Surprised by the comment, the corporal turned to face the sergeant and asked to explain himself. Listen to the rhythm of each shell that lands. Listen for the boom of each explosion. After some seconds, the corporal's face quickly came alight. For a split second, though, as his spirit darkened with pessimism immediately after, as he understood its implications. Confused, the private and the radio man, who were busy physically arguing with the stubborn radio until then, asked the two for clarifications. The enemy's bombardment is extremely well-timed, frighteningly so. It's like a metronome of death, with each half-second bringing an explosion as a shell hits its intended target without fail. Even as we speak, round after round is exploding with mechanical precision, just like a diligent drummer following the conductor without hesitation. The enemy's artillerymen are doing a damn good job, explained the sergeant with a tone of admiration for his unknown adversaries. But just as he was about to jump down from the edge of the trench to carry on with his many unattended business, the corporal grabbed the back of his coat's sleeve and energetically pulled it to gain his attention. Sarge, look at our trenches. He spoke in a forceful and commanding tone, a stark contrast to his typically cheerful demeanor. Perplexed, the veteran turned around and aligned the magnifying lenses to his eyes once again. Moments passed with neither of the two saying a word, but the private could discern everything the sergeant was thinking by carefully studying the expression on his jaded face, partially concealed behind the cylindrical black gear. Fuck, the sergeant said suddenly, startling the two men looking up to him from the base of the furrow. What is it? Worriedly asked the private, now sweating in cold and unexplainable terror, fearful of the terrifying vastness of the possible responses. The shells are landing inside our trenches. Not a single one missed the dugouts of the first line. Every single one of them hit their mark. Down to the centimeter, said the corporal with a dead monotone as he kept scanning the forward positions. The implications were clear for everyone present. The private was just about to open his mouth when a loud scream interrupted him. A guttural cry filled to the brim with urgency and desperation. "Message from HQ," managed to say out loud the specialist, severely out of breath and in terrible shape. He held his aching lower abdomen with one hand and a rag of paper with the other as the worn-out patch of the military police dangled from the sleeve of his uniform. "Message from HQ," he kept repeating with no end, like a broken record. The corporal, frustrated and with boiling blood, forcefully opened a plastic chair and shoved the specialist down onto it, who, unable to resist, resignedly fell into the seat. Without wasting time, the sergeant snatched the piece of paper from the breathless man and barked something to the private, who, yet again, disappeared in the intricate layer of trenches. His eyes widened and contracted as he carefully read the contents. His heart seemingly sank lower and lower as he made his way to the bottom of the communication. The corporal was about to ask about the paper when a deep voice spoke in his stead. "What's going on, Sergeant?" said an officer as he walked on them, followed by his adjutant and the private. Pale and wide-eyed, the sergeant was evidently having trouble expressing his mind. So much so that the specialist had to intervene, finally freed from the invisible burden weighing on his chest that impeded his breathing. "The HQ has been lost, sir," calmly said as he spun his head to look at the major. "Explain yourself. Now." The specialist reached out to grasp the dirty document he was entrusted with but hesitated halfway through, realizing there was no need to subject them all to the overwhelming amount of text. He decided that his simple statement would suffice for now. Rocking his head back to look at the cloudy sky, he took a big breath before gazing back at his fellow soldiers with a loud exhale. "It's a mess. It's all a big, fucking mess. Like fireflies in the holy night, enemy units popped out of nowhere behind our lines. They blew up ammo depots, railway hubs, radio stations, and everything in between. Some targeted our artillery positions, quickly overwhelming our unprepared artillerists, while others disabled our air defense network from within." The listeners stood quiet, in dead silence. Where they could not get close, or in the few instances they were repulsed, they simply called in airstrikes. As their crafts now soar uncontested in the sky, he said as he slowly regained his composure. "Our lines have been breached. The enemy has achieved breakthroughs in every sector, taking advantage of the confusion they ruthlessly created. We suspect enemy airmobile units are heading north, swiftly overrunning the oil fields while heavily mechanized formations are currently stubbornly pushing through our southern underbelly, panic-stricken as our chain of command has been paralyzed. They will soon reach the capital." "And what about us?" murmured the private, astonished and lost. The last order from high command, before it was turned into a smoking crater, was for you to hold the line. As long as possible. Just as the specialist finished talking, everyone's attention was diverted as the rumble of artillery suddenly ceased, and quietness returned on the front lines. Hesitantly, they climbed back up and slowly poked their heads out from the shallow ditch they were hiding in. In complete hush, they all watched as the dust slowly fell graciously, as the last shell had landed. Before them, an alien yet somewhat familiar landscape presented itself to the observers. Simple, snow-filled fields and barren expanses were distinctive of the world after the bombs. "Look! Over there!" The private screamed in terror as he pointed at undistinctive cones of lights that were quickly and furiously moving under the shower of dust and particles that still floated as a result of the bombardment. Horrified, the soldiers glared at the hundreds of armored vehicles quickly approaching their positions under the shrouding embrace of the night as fear tightly grasped their bodies and spirits. Everyone kept staring at the overwhelming show of power, at the arrogant and prideful fist of steel about to savagely smash into the paper-thin positions. Everyone but the sergeant. As if under suggestion by a higher entity, or maybe a macabre premonition, He raised his sight to the sky, where he diligently scouted its entirety, looking at each minute detail, seemingly searching for something. A brush stroke out of place. A simple shape. A minute object inaudibly flying over them just beneath the grim, gloomy clouds caught his attention. He stared at it inquisitively, wondering about its purpose. With a swift motion, he aimed his binoculars at the peculiar entity. He could not make out its exact shape or form, but he noticed a sphere-like appendage that rested on its belly. For some unknowable reason, his instinct told him that thing was staring back at him with its cold, ruthless, and mechanical eye. He realized it was pointing directly at them. But his contemplative stare-down did not last long, as a 155mm laser-guided artillery shell burst in the air just a couple of centimeters from the top of the trench. As their lifeless bodies lay there in the cold, undignified ditch, the ground violently shook as heavy, tracked vehicles, proudly waving high a blue flag, uncaringly rolled over their positions, now left unmanned in their entirety. Just a few steps away from the specialist's hand, dipped in the dirty water infested by rodents, lay the piece of paper he had worked so hard to deliver. Even though it was partially covered in blood, mud, and ash, one could still clearly read the last line at the bottom of the document written in bold and darker characters, making it easy for everyone to understand the seriousness behind it. Hold the line. The humans are coming.